Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Welcome to a holiday season bonus episode of Diplomatic Immunity, where we'll be talking about basketball and the power of sports diplomacy as we celebrate World Basketball Day, the first sport ever to receive the honor from the United Nations, which now takes place every year on December 21st. Today, I'm delighted to talk with Lindsay Krasnoff about basketball and the history of sports diplomacy. Just in time for World Basketball Day, Lindsay has just published a case study with us on the fascinating history of basketball diplomacy between France and China during the Cold War, which we encourage listeners to check out via our case studies library. Find the store on our website, isd.georgetown.edu. Professors can also access all case studies for free via our faculty lounge.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Dr. Lindsay Sarah Krasnoff is a historian, writer, and consultant working at the intersection of global sports, communications, and diplomacy. Author of Basketball Empire, France and the Making of a Global NBA and WNBA, published by Bloomsbury in 2023, her work on French and global sports appears with CNN International, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and more. A veteran of the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Historian, Krasnoff co-directed the Basketball Diplomacy in Africa Oral History Project for the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS University of London as a research associate, and lectures on sports diplomacy and global sports at the NYU Tisch Institute for Global Sports. Let's listen in to the conversation. Lindsay, thanks for joining us. Always good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always fun to chat shop, and particularly to do so with you, given your various different synergies with sports and diplomacy.
So, let's just start this off with the basic question for our listeners. What is sports diplomacy? And, you're an academic that writes about sports diplomacy. So how long has it really been a thing? And how long and how have academics looked at this?
So sports diplomacy is a newer phrase for a phenomenon that's been going on for quite some time. It is when the intersection of the diplomatic realm hits that of the sporting world. And, certainly some of the earliest examples we have of that go back to the ancient Greeks and how they used sports, like the former Olympics, in their endeavors. Fast forward, modern sports diplomacy has been around pretty much since the advent of modern sport and its international ties in the late 19th and early 20th century. However, the field of sports diplomacy, as we currently know of it, was really begun almost about 15 years ago by several academics, Simon Rofe, Stuart Murray, and Jeff Pigman, in terms of formalizing the field as an academic, interdisciplinary field of academic study, and also working more closely hand in hand with the practitioner side, whether that be the diplomatic policymakers or the sports actors themselves. And so when we talk about sports diplomacy, kind of the working definition I use is akin to 3x3 basketball, topical for us today. It is when the three acts of diplomacy, communication, representation, and negotiation intersect through the sports world through one or more of three exchanges: cultural exchange, knowledge exchange, or technical exchange. And so when you think about it, these sorts of engagements occur organically within a global sports world today, which is why in our 21st century internet-connected, social media networked world, the concept of who engages in sports diplomacy has become far more diffuse. And so perhaps your listeners are much more familiar with formal or official sports diplomacy, that undertaken by officially credentialed representatives of a state, whether that's a head of state, credentialed ambassador, or a diplomatic officer, an organizing committee for a major sporting event, or elite athletes who are representing the nation in international competition. Those are the kinds of formalized or official sports diplomacy that We've seen time and time again, particularly since the 20th century. Here, I'm thinking within the frame of basketball. We look at the 1972 Munich Olympic basketball tournament, overshadowed by the horrific terrorist events of those games. But certainly that gold medal match between the United States and the Soviet Union, hugely contested in the last seconds of that match, lives on in infamy. And many of the United States players still refuse those silver medals in protest of that. So that's, I think, the type of sports diplomacy that is on the minds of most diplomats, particularly today. But because engagement has become so more diffuse, today, everyday citizens are empowered to engage and partake in sports diplomacy, kind of what we call the more unofficial or informal sports diplomats. And this is, everyone else within the global sport ecosystem, non-state sports actors, to use the more technical term. And that's everyone from leagues like the NBA or the Premier League, to teams, to international federations, FIFA, FIBA, to athletes themselves, particularly given their global platforms, and the sponsors, the NGOs, the media, everyone who helped to make today's global sports world increasingly ever interconnected one.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up sort of the new players or the diffuse actors in this realm as well, because that's something I was going to ask you anyways, highlighting the fact that this isn't just sort of state to state sports diplomacy and things like that. There's the players, the teams, the leagues are all doing this to some extent and in some ways. Interestingly, basketball is the first sport that's gotten its own UN recognized day. So why basketball?
Such a great question. And one of the reasons why I've been so fascinated by and privileged to help pioneer the basketball diplomacy side of the field. Basketball is perhaps maybe the second global team sport. It's certainly far behind football, soccer in terms of numbers. When you talk about consumer issues, when you talk about mediatization, when you talk about just the size and the reach. Yet, the fascinating thing about basketball is that it's what I call one of these first born global team sports. It was invented by a Canadian in the United States in 1891 in Springfield, Massachusetts. And 2 years later, which was a relatively short period of time for that era, when you think about it, in 1893, it was exported for the first time beyond North American shores to France, to Paris, where the first game on European soil was played December 27th, 1893. And from there, the spread was far more rapid. We see basketball being played in far corners of the globe shortly thereafter. In 1894, it's in South America. In 1895, in certain cities in China. By 1897, we have basketball recorded in Australia. By the eve of World War I in 1914, basketball is being played across Western Europe, in Russia, in parts of East Asia and South America. So it's played everywhere. And by the First World War served as a watershed moment, further spreading but also democratizing the game. By the late 1920s and 1930s, it's also recorded being played across certain parts of Africa. And so we have a truly kind of more global span. And one of the reasons why basketball, I would argue, is primed for sports diplomacy is that while the NBA has helped to fuel its popularity and spread and rise, particularly since 1992 and the US Dream Team, it is not necessarily an Americanization or an American thing per se, because what the NBA has done is to help put a spotlight on, say, an elite version of basketball that, as writer Alexander Wolf has noted, has been in existence in indigenous cultures for over 100 years. So the fact that basketball has been played by all corners of the world for decades helps to entrench it.
You mentioned the global nature of basketball today. And when we look at the sport, especially in the United States and the NBA, the premier league in the world right now, some of the top stars and most of the recent MVPs are foreign-born players. So, you've got the Greek Freak, obviously from Greece. You've got the Joker from Serbia. You've got Wembanyama now from the insanely popular and potentially amazing rookie for the San Antonio Spurs from France. And the list goes on and on. And there's even talk I've seen of potentially turning the All-Star game into a world players versus American players instead of doing the old sort of East-West or the picking teams kind of thing, which I think would be very interesting. How has this also helped, and what does it mean for these players that then that go abroad to play for these different teams and stuff?
Well, that's what adds very much to the basketball diplomacy mix, that in the world's best championship for the time being, and likely for quite some time, you have some of the world's best players. And so everyone's got a bit of skin in the game, as it were. And that helps to make today's NBA in the 2020s more of a global NBA. And that's something that I think many parts of the world can buy into, especially if you're Cameroon and it is your, homegrown Joel Embiid, who is, one of the star players and well recognized. If you're, Serbia, if you're France, if you're Australia, Canada, any of these other countries who have been producing MVPs, all stars, all NBA teams, defensive players of the year. It helps to make it a little less quote unquote foreign and makes the NBA kind of one of the premier international leagues. We often think of, say, the Premier League in England as kind of one of the first imprints of a truly global professional elite sports league. I would say that the NBA is very quickly starting to come into the same rungs of import and perhaps surpassing it in certain ways, thanks to the way that basketball is more than just a game and a profession, but it's also a lifestyle culture. It's tied into music and art and film and fashion in a way that the Premier League is not to the same extent. It certainly has some of those, but the cultural dominance is not there in quite the same way that we see with a global kind of basketball imprimatur. And I think also part of that is tied into the fact that basketball is not just a sport for men and boys, but also for women and girls. This feeds into your original question about why basketball and World Basketball Day. It's played by everyone everywhere. And the fact that for many societies and cultures, basketball has long been a sport kind of promoted and seen for women and girls to play as well, that it has not suffered the same types of negative stereotypes or stigmatisms that women's soccer has. That helps to answer the question about why basketball is not just a men's game, it's also a women's game. And in some countries, their women's team or their women's game is more successful or has much stronger, longer sporting success than on the men's side.
So you wrote a case study for us recently on basketball diplomacy. So can you give us, a couple examples of that, both maybe official and what we call unofficial basketball diplomacy, and then but there's also sports diplomacy that goes on in other sports, whether it be soccer, or, everybody probably immediately thinks of ping pong diplomacy in the 70s. So it'd be interesting to see another couple of examples of sports diplomacy that you might want listeners to think about.
So the recent case study is on France's basketball diplomacy with China, looking at both historic examples as well as more recent examples to illustrate how the concept of sports diplomacy has changed, as well as the nature of the game and how different countries interact. So the origin story of this particular case study began over lunch one day when I was conducting research for my recent book, Basketball Empire, France and the Making of a Global NBA and WNBA. And I was interviewing two former French national team members about their work and their experiences in the sports diplomacy framework. And somehow it came up amongst one of them that, oh, yes, remember that time we went to China in 1966? And literally it was, the record scratch stop. Everything came to a halt. I said, what trip to China in summer of 1966, remembering, in the back of my mind that that was the start of the Chinese Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong and the changing of the cultural guard, as it were. And they're like, oh, yes, yeah, of course we went to China. They very much reminded me that France has a very different diplomatic history than the United States, even though the two are very close friends and allies, that they have historically interacted with parts of the world differently. And I proceeded to learn a little bit of that very first example of basketball diplomacy between France and mainland China in summer of 1966. And it was one of the earliest acts of formal sports diplomacy that we have. The French national men's basketball team was sent to China in summer of 1966 as part of an effort this was part of France and China cementing diplomatic ties, which had been recently reestablished in 1964. And when I went into the archives and I had to dig around, I finally found records, not where I first intended them to be, but finally found records helping to explain why it was basketball at this particular time that was used. And after the establishment of diplomatic relations, the Chinese impressed upon their French counterparts that they very much wanted to exchange national teams in sport to solidify the friendship and for cultural exchanges. And they petitioned the French to send the national football team, the soccer team, and a variety of other teams. The French, through their internal documentation, noted that they could not send the national soccer team because FIFA at the time did not recognize the People's Republic of China. Instead, they recognized the Republic of China out of Taipei. And so it was mandated that if a national team were to be sent to Beijing, it had to be from a sport whose international federation recognized Beijing. And at the time, there were three. One was ping pong. One was something else that I can't recall immediately. The other was basketball. And so that's how basketball became the French men's basketball team became the first Western national team to visit mainland China after the communist takeover of the mainland in 1949. And it's a really fascinating case study, both from kind of the more formal sports diplomacy angle, but also from the kind of the humanistic level, what it was like for three French players who I had the opportunity to interview to go to China, and the wonder of that experience for them, keeping in mind that in 1966, China had been closed to the West for a generation at least. And so there's great curiosity on behalf of the players. One came out of national team retirement specifically so that he could go on this particular trip and see for himself. And so this experience had a huge imprint on the players, not necessarily on the technical exchange part, but specifically on the cultural exchange part and better understanding what China was like. Of course, they had very limited interactions while they were in China that summer. They were there for 2 weeks. They were allowed to interact with their 3 translators from China, who they suspected were part of the Chinese security service, but they were not able to as easily interact with the Chinese national team and coaches except at official banquets where things were supervised and overseen, and there was always a translator present. So that's one example that can be found in the case study. Another comes from the return trip. The next time that the French national teams visited mainland China was in 1980, August 1980, kind of in the aftermath of the Moscow Summer Games, which China did boycott. France did not, but the basketball teams did not qualify, so it was kind of a moot point. And the return trip in 1980 was taken by both the men's national team as well as the women's national team. And so it was all about friendship and solidarity, not necessarily competition, but again, another exchange, cultural exchange trip between the two national sides. And it's interesting in that, on that particular one, the French national team had 2 naturalized Frenchmen on them, both who were born and raised in the United States. So also brought into kind of issue this player mobility and how different perspectives fed into representing, or at least from the French perspective, who was French. Um, these two American-born members of the French national team were there representing, what modern France could be like to the Chinese who came to view them.
Those examples, especially the 1966 example, are extremely interesting for a number of reasons that you noted, but especially the fact that, you're going into still closed China for many countries. It had to be just a fascinating trip and very interesting to get to chat with those players. We also have an Olympics coming up again next year, and they're in Paris. And you mentioned the 1972 Olympics and the controversy that still is around that final gold medal basketball game that took place between the Soviet Union and the United States. And you mentioned the 1980 Olympics, which was boycotted, the Summer Olympics, by the United States and others because of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Are you kind of on the lookout for political turmoil happening that we should be on the lookout for coming up in Paris? Where are we on sort of Russian athletes being able to go and things like that, I guess, is part of that.
So there's numerous kind of more geopolitical or diplomatic storylines that I'm following heading into Paris 2024. You're absolutely right. One of the first and foremost is the issue of whether or not Russian and Belarusian athletes can compete at the Olympics under a neutral banner. And I believe it was recently ruled that Russian athletes could, under a neutral banner, as long as they were not part of the Russian state, so military. I'm not sure how the IOC can work to guarantee that, understanding that the Russian military does sponsor many of their athletes, as many other countries' militaries do, right? This is not a purely Russian phenomenon, but certainly it's a part of the equation. So that is going to be one of the big storylines. And then similarly, the Ukrainian response. And should Russian athletes and Belarusian athletes compete at the Summer Games, even under a neutral banner, if they do have to compete against their Ukrainian counterparts, what that looks like, what the reactions are, not just between the athletes, but also among the crowds, the spectators. So that's one line. Another line is the refugee team that will be competing at the Olympics as an official refugee delegation. And I saw that recently the chef de mission, right, the head of that mission, who's also an athlete, is a believe Afghan refugee who's been living and training in France. So, who is making up that refugee team and how they do, and what they do, I think is going to be very interesting. Another line I'm looking on is certainly, which of the Summer Olympic athletes utilize that platform or not, given the constraints of the Olympic rules over protest and advocacy. So that's always a curious line. I'm also, my home field as a French specialist, so I am keeping an eye on French sports diplomacy and how French diplomats, as well as the apparatus of state and the state sports systems, are using the games in a variety of different ways for their sports diplomacy efforts, both official, formal, as well as informally.
So I want to get you out here on this question. So in recent years, especially in like the last two, there's been more and more discussion about an emphasis on this term sports washing. And, when you think sports washing, you think Russia getting the World Cup and the Olympics. You think Saudi Arabia trying to get the World Cup and, buying soccer players and creating a golf league and everything to try to burnish their record by spending all this money to get people's attention away from maybe human rights abuses or invasions of other countries and that sort of thing. So, what are your thoughts on sports washing and what we've seen in the past couple of years?
So I think the term sports washing is also in the eyes of the beholder. It is usually used in the negative capacity, but by those in the West. And um, it's also usually meant in terms of when someone's trying to, hide or divert attention. When you look at the statements in terms of those from countries who are accused of sports washing, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Rwanda to a certain extent, when you look at their stated reasons for why they're investing in sports and sports diplomacy, they come right out and say that it is for investment for the youth to build a different industry that's not related to petrodollars, or for a wide variety of different reasonings. Yes, probably also it is, helpful to burnish their image to use sports in this way. I think that the term sports washing is one that needs to be used with, a certain degree of context and clarity. I do think that many countries around the world use sports in a wide variety of ways, ultimately to try to help the nation and its reputation in certain ways.
All right. Well, Lindsay, it's always good to chat, and I appreciate you taking the time, and looking forward to World Basketball Day, and I'm even more excited for the basketball portion of the Olympics now. We'll have to see who makes what teams and all that kind of stuff. So,
Well, that's why the Tokyo gold medal game, where France was within 5 points of the US the last 10 seconds, if one of those last calls had gone another way, it would have been a very different outcome. And that's what, not just because I just wrote a book on French basketball and this, benefits it, but it makes for a much more interesting competition all around when it's close. The world's got game, and that's what makes it really compelling.
yeah, exactly. Are you going to be there for the games?
Yes, I have some tickets, including for the opening round of the men's basketball tournament, which is in Lille in the north and not in Paris itself.
Oh, bummer. You'll just have to be in northern France instead of Paris. So.
I know, hardship, right?
All right. Well, listen, Lindsay, always good to chat. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you again to Lindsay for her time and thoughts. This episode was produced by Jarrett Dang and Freddie Mallinson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. Happy holidays from all of us here at ISD. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.